When Georgia's governor signed a law restricting voting access, Major League Baseball moved its All-Star game, triggering conservatives to decry this as cancel culture. Fallout continues and forces big business to confront their own culture. Will these efforts make a difference in what is being called modern-day Jim Crow voting laws? We'll talk Georgia, business, and boycotts, all coming up next.
Live from Los Angeles, this is the Special Report.
A red state flipped blue for the first time in decades during the last presidential election, thanks to the turnout of black voters at the polls. Roughly 88% of black voters chose Biden in Georgia. Let's take a look at what Republicans are attempting to do and what pushback is happening right now. Here to help us understand all of this is Danielle Root. She is the Director of Voting Rights and Access to Justice on the Democracy Government Reform Team at the Center for American Progress. Good morning and welcome to the show, Danielle.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
So Danielle, help us understand so many headlines about Georgia. What's going on? You know, if you listen to the left, you think it's the worst thing since Jim Crow and Reconstruction. If you listen to the right, they say it's just a bunch of Democrats who are whining. A lot to do about nothing, says the Republicans. So help us. What's going on in your state?
So this is a really, really bad bill that just passed and is now law in Georgia. Democrats are not whining. The people of Georgia are not, over-exaggerating how bad this bill is. To just kind of lay out what exactly is in the bill, the biggest takeaway is that it severely limits access to mail voting in the state. And let's remember that last year in places like Georgia and in states all over the country, vote by mail was a really, really important resource and was relied upon by millions of voters, more than any number of voters that have relied on the policy in the past, because of the coronavirus and because of the need to have safe and effective and reliable voting options. And in response to that, or perhaps in reaction to that, Republican lawmakers in Georgia saw how many people use that method of voting in 2020 and decided that they couldn't allow that to happen in future elections. So this bill would make it make the period of time when a voter can request a mail ballot significantly less. It would also require anybody who wants to vote with a mail ballot to provide an ID or form of ID, even when they request it, but also on the back end when they return it. Previously, you did not need to provide the state or local officials with any form of ID to get a ballot of this kind, and you only had to supply your signature when you returned it. So this is a huge impediment for a lot of voters, and we know that people who are least likely to have forms of ID are voters of color, low-income Americans, older Americans, and also younger Americans. So that's one of the biggest takeaways. There are also restrictions on provisional ballots. There are restrictions on allowing voters to be given food and drink while waiting in the hot Georgia sun in line, which is just an incredibly cruel provision. So there's lots of really terrible things in this bill that will make it significantly harder for voters of color in particular to vote in future cycles.
So let's unpack, what you just told us, which is a lot in terms of what the bill does. Let's start with this whole ID in order to, vote by mail. So under the new provision, you're going to have to make a photocopy of your ID. How do you present your ID if you're voting by mail based on the new law?
So the law sort of lays out various ways that somebody can provide a form of ID. So, I think the law makes clear that the preference is to provide your driver's license number or your state ID number, which if you don't have a driver's license or a state issued ID, you don't have that number. You can also provide your social security number, but even if you do that, you have to fixate a photocopy of your face and, some additional documentation along with that. So, the law sort of pretends to give voters options in lieu of an ID, but none of the options are really a good substitute or one that a lot of voters are going to be able to meet.
Yeah, We know, Danielle, that this whole voter identification is a way to restrict voting. But the governor of Georgia has pushed back and said that there are many states that require these IDs. Can you give us some sense about where Georgia stands now as it relates to other states that may have similar provisions in their voting laws?
So Georgia is among just a handful of states, mostly southern states, mostly headed by Republican governors and state legislatures that require very strict forms of ID when it comes to voting. So this is usually like a photo ID, but it has to be a driver's license. It has to be another, 4 or 5 very limited forms of ID that count towards this requirement. There are, variations of voter ID requirements in other states. So some states, instead of a photo ID, allow you to bring a utility bill or a paycheck or a letter that's simply addressed to your home to prove your identity. So on the sliding scale of ID requirements or proof of identity requirements,
restrictive side.
Much more restrictive.
So we know there have been some lawsuits that have already been filed and that this law is going to be challenged probably all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. We know definitely to the Georgia Supreme Court. But are there any efforts being made in the interim to make sure that African Americans and other minorities in the state have whatever identification that's required so that people can feel comfortable that they can still request a mail-in ballot and be able to vote while the law makes its way through the court system?
So I can't speak to any grassroots efforts that are going on in the state, but I do know that just within the last few days, the mayor of Atlanta recently issued an executive order saying that her government is going to be launching a massive voter education campaign that is going to be educating voters on what they need to comply with all of these new requirements in the law so that they can have their ballots counted in the next cycle.
No, glad to hear that. Thank you for informing us about that. Let's talk about this food and water. I think that's the provision that really makes people's blood boil, because that seems so punitive. As you said, the long lines in the heat of Georgia. I've had many guests on the show, voters who stood in those long lines to vote in both the primary, then the general presidential election, and then turned around and did it in a special election for the 2 senators in Georgia. And I can't imagine what purpose is being served by saying, I can't give an elderly person in the line a bottle of water, or, I can't help someone that maybe, is a diabetic that needs to eat something, before they get low blood sugar. So what, is the governor and the legislature trying to do with this provision other than punish people?
There is no rational motivation for this provision in the law. They claim that the reason is to prevent campaigns and candidates from intimidating voters in line, but that's not what happens. That just ignores reality. The people who are giving out food and water are usually community organizers, or they're people who live across the street that see these terrible long lines and want to help however they can by handing out an unbranded water bottle. There is simply no good reason to restrict access to basic food and water for people who are waiting in these incredibly long lines that Georgia always has.
Yeah, and I can imagine that Georgia, like most states, probably already have some laws that prevent people from, engaging in any kind of, campaigning within a certain, feet of a polling place. Aren't there laws like that probably already in place in Georgia?
That's exactly right. Georgia already has laws on the books that prohibit the kind of electioneering that the lawmakers in passing this law said were necessary for this restriction. So it's just duplicative and totally unnecessary.
I can't wait to see all the folks who are going to descend on Georgia with water and food just to piss off the legislators, just to be the first that get arrested under this really punitive law. I want to ask you about another provision that I think has me also very worried, and that's the control that is given to the legislature over election officials, because we saw in that 2020 election all of this pressure that Donald Trump put on those Georgia election officials, particularly the one, to fine him 11,000 votes. They fine me 11,000 votes. So how does the control that's now given to the legislature over those election officials, how does it differ from what the current situation is now?
The new law would change the makeup of the state board of elections so that, in particular, sort of one of the most concerning provisions is the fact that it removes the Secretary of State as the chairman of the state board of elections and moves him into a non-voting member of the board. So this is clearly a punishment for going against Trump in the 2020 election. But in terms of the legislature, what it does, and it grants the legislature significantly more power in overseeing elections, because it allows the legislature to appoint members of that board. And the state board of elections is very powerful. It makes a lot of determinations on how elections are run. And another provision that's related to that, which you alluded to, is the fact that it allows the legislature to suspend election superintendents. So if an election official does something that the state legislature doesn't like, they can remove that person or suspend that person. There are limits. I think the law says that the legislature can't remove more than 4 election superintendents at a time. But, just removing one is enough to intimidate many others who are otherwise doing the right thing, but who the state legislature feels should actually be deciding things in favor of Republicans.
Is there any requirement that these appointments, reflect any kind of bipartisanship, or can they just appoint all, conservative election officials?
So there are certainly in the bill notes to, that this should be sort of nonpartisan. And, they say, some members have to be appointed by the Senate and others by the House equivalent. But the Georgia legislature in both chambers is Republican controlled. Yeah. Make no mistake, Republicans are going to make the decisions on who is appointed, and it is Republican legislatures who are going to be able to, unfortunately, get very close to manipulating elections.
Yeah, I keep thinking of more things that irritate me about this law the more you talk. So the other thing that happened around this law was the way in which it was signed. Behind closed doors, looked like 4 or 5 white men flanking the governor. And we saw this African-American, lawmaker on the outside, very, calmly knocking on the door, trying to gain access, trying to, create some sunlight, some transparency. And we saw her get hauled off to jail and charged, although we know the charges have been dismissed. But we saw this horrific image of this lawmaker being, pulled away, with these big, strong, law enforcement guys. And we were thinking, of course, about January 6th, where we couldn't find law enforcement arresting anyone. But why the secrecy? Why behind closed doors? Why not, before the entire legislature, even those that don't necessarily or didn't necessarily agree with the law or vote for the law?
It's because they knew what they were doing was wrong. Quite frankly, the process of getting this law passed and signed was chaotic from the start. There were so many versions of this bill, and it was changing all of the time. At one point, it went from like a 25-page bill to a 100-page bill virtually overnight, and was passed before many members were even able to finish and analyze the whole thing. And then, the governor signed it behind closed doors. No one was allowed in the room. The lawmaker who showed up to see what was going on and to have a say and to, voice her concerns was taken away by law enforcement. And as you alluded to, law enforcement is conveniently around when, in some circumstances and not in others. And I think that, the whole thing stinks of bad intentions and bad actors.
Yeah. Stacey Abrams said that rather than grappling with whether their ideology is causing them to fail, they are instead relying on what has worked in the past. Instead of winning new voters, they're rigging the system against participation and basically stealing the right to vote. Some people think that this law is really about preventing Stacey Abrams from winning the next governor's race that's coming up next year, if she decides to run against Governor Kemp. Do you think he's motivated by the fact that Stacey has become this national, shero, and has gotten, this incredible platform that probably says if she runs again, if she chooses to, she probably beats Kemp?
I think it's certainly possible. I think I think Republicans are scared of anyone who could possibly beat them. And I think they really saw the power of voters and of Black voters in the 2020 election. And they are frightened. And I think Stacey Abrams is absolutely right that the 2020 election, with the defeat of Donald Trump, should have been a time when the Republican Party should have taken some lessons away from that. And it would have been a great time for them to reform their platform and to change it so that it was actually responsive to what the voters want. And instead of that, they decided to cheat by introducing and passing and signing into law these voter suppression bills because they know they can't win with what they've got going on currently.
Yeah, and sadly, Danielle, we know they haven't been too quiet about vocalizing that, saying if everybody votes, we lose. So again, rather than working on, developing platforms that appeal to greater voters, rather than ending the racist dog whistle that's, become so I won't say it's new to their party, but it's so pervasive and so obvious. They'd rather, enact these restrictive laws. Unfortunately, Iowa and other states have passed similar, voting restriction laws. What do you think this means, particularly midterms coming up in 2022? We know there's already the House, the Democratic lead in the House is very narrow, 50-50 in the in the U.S. Senate. Chances are the Democrats could lose the Senate and could lose the House, particularly with these restrictive voting laws. Where do we go from here? What do we do?
It's deeply troubling. I think the trend that we are seeing across the country, the Brennan Center for Justice recently put out an analysis. There are 361 voter suppression bills that have already been introduced in states. And we're likely to see even more bills being introduced in coming weeks and months. And this is why we really need there to be national voting and election standards in place. And luckily, the U.S. House of Representatives has already passed the For the People Act and the Voting Rights Advancement Act, and they are sitting with the Senate right now, which is really fantastic. These bills would set national baseline voting standards, things like vote by mail, early voting, same-day voter registration that help millions of voters access the ballot box each election. They would make sure that there is equal access to these policies everywhere in the country, whether you live in the North, the South, the East, the West, rural, city. And that is why we need these national pieces of legislation, because they would thwart virtually every single voter suppression bill that we are seeing in the states right now.
Last question for you. How encouraged or not, given Joe Manchin, the Democrat who's become the czar, the king, the power maker, who has said he's adamantly opposed to any changes to the filibuster, very clear that the Republicans are not in the mood to negotiate any kind of voting rights law, get it passed with the midterms coming up. So how encouraged are you at all that the For the People Act or any of the voting rights laws that have been passed by the House will actually, make it through the Senate?
I think that the fact of the matter is that the vast majority of Americans, members of both parties, the majority of them support what's in these bills. And so if federal lawmakers are serious about representing the interests of their constituents, then they need to support the For the People Act and the Voting Rights Advancement Act, because otherwise they are ignoring the will of the people who vote for them and put them in power. And I hope that Joe Manchin and Republican members of Congress will recognize that and, will be responsive to their voters, but we'll have to wait and see.
Yeah, we got to leave it there, Danielle. And I think you're right. We have to wait and see. And as citizens, as voters, we have to put pressure on our elected officials to do the right thing and to stand up for democracy and stand up for the right of all people to vote. Again, thank you so much for your work, and thank you for joining me this morning.
Thank you so much for having me.
Corporations are taking a stand against voter restriction laws in Georgia, including big corporations like Delta, Coca-Cola, and Major League Baseball. But now Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell is warning these companies to stay out of politics. But here to help us understand more what's happening with corporations in Georgia and all over this country is Melvin Coleman. He is the Executive Director of Atlanta Black Chambers. Good morning, and thank you for joining us, Melvin.
Good morning. Pleasure to be here.
So, Melvin, let me ask you, African-American corporate CEOs, they were some of the first to come out and call on companies to fight these restrictive voting laws. Were you surprised to see, like, the CEO of Merck and some of these other Fortune 500 companies take such, an aggressive stand and posture as it relates to voting laws?
I can't say I was surprised, but I have to say when I saw it live on television, I knew that this was the real start of something big, because those individuals, having navigated our system and corporate America, being Black men, they are very thorough about their business. So when I saw them speaking about the legislation, that was a powerful example of what we're dealing with.
So help us understand, because the news is reported in a way that suggests that some of these big companies, Coca-Cola, Delta, didn't speak up soon enough, and that now we're trying to dig out of a hole, and perhaps had they spoken up prior to the law being passed, maybe it wouldn't have made its way through, the Georgia legislature. What do you say to folks that say these companies, too little, too late?
Well, Atlanta has a rich history. I mean, we're a business-first city, very progressive, a rich history, in particular when you talk about the Black business community. And corporations have taken stands in the city's history to do the right thing. Even when Dr. King won the Nobel Peace Prize and Coca-Cola made sure that he was recognized for that, and there were people in the city who did not want to do that. So we expect them to take these positions. I happen to know that they were at the table. Earlier versions of the legislation, it was horrible. And it was corporate leaders that actually had the governor and his people remove a lot of that. But
so you're saying corporations, but for their involvement, the law would have been worse.
I believe that. But once the community saw the final version, it was still like, no, this does not work. And so they had to reposition.
So let's talk about boycotts. So we know there's been a call for the boycotting of some of these major corporations, but we've seen very prominent, social justice advocates like Bernice King. You mentioned Dr. King, his daughter, come out and say that, boycott is not the way to go. And I think Stacey Abrams also talked about, that boycotts are not the way to address what's happening in Georgia. What is your position?
Well, I don't like the mixed messaging coming from Black leadership, because you get a mixed response. And so right now, the boycott issue is pending. There's a meeting next week, okay? And we will see if we actually will be moving forward with a boycott. The community is meeting with corporate leaders, and so the boycott is pending. So we don't have a position right now, and we're optimistic that the outcome would allow us to move forward in a better way. This is a difficult time, and it puts us in a tough position as a business community.
Yeah, I want to bring in, I see Cliff Albright is here, and I want to bring him on. He is a co-founder and executive director of Black Voters Matter, and you can't think about what happened in Georgia without thinking about this organization, Black Voters Matter. Cliff and his co-founder, Latasha Brown, have risen to national prominence because of the great work they did in organizing and galvanizing voters in the state of Georgia, and really being credited for flipping the state from red to blue. So good morning, and thanks so much for returning to the show, Cliff. I'm going to call you a friend of the show because you've been here before. So talking to Melvin. Melvin's a business dude. He's a executive director of a chamber, so he represents business interests. You're a grassroots organizer. So jump in and tell me what you're thinking about what's going on in Georgia around this new law that's been passed and signed into, by your governor that has us in California wondering what y'all doing down there.
Well, first, thanks for having me. And yes, you just did a great analysis with your previous guest of all the many things that are wrong with this law. They were able to take out a couple of provisions that had gotten a lot of attention before the law was signed. But that did not leave, that left still literally dozens of provisions that are harmful. Part of what we believe is that if the business community had come out sooner, and not even just to do things behind the scenes. I respect what my brother was saying about, how they some of them may have been doing some things behind the scenes, but let's think about it. When Coca-Cola, I won't even just pick on Coca-Cola because at least they've come out, but when these companies are facing legislation against their industry, they don't just do stuff behind the scenes, right? They send their lobbyists to the Capitol. They do PSAs. They do commercials. They got all kinds of fancy brochures and talking points, and they are very public about their opposition. When they're trying to sell their products, Coca-Cola doesn't try to sell their products behind the scenes, right? How do they persuade the market about buying their products, whether it's a soda or taking a flight or buying some home tools or whatever? They don't do that behind the scenes, do they? They do it very openly and very publicly, and they actually put a lot of marketing resources in front of it. And so what we've been saying is that if they have done the same thing on this issue of voter suppression, if they had used some of that same outreach, communications, and marketing expertise, not to mention the full force of their political leverage behind the scenes as well as very publicly, we would not be in this situation right now. If the entire Fortune 500 had done what those 72 Black executives did last week, which was I applaud them, a passionate response. Like that ad they put in the Times was very clear, was unequivocal, was a moral call, right? If that had come from more companies ahead of time, not behind the scenes, but very publicly, we would not be in this situation, right? And so that's what we've been saying. Now, is it too late for them to do things? No, it's not. It's never too late to do the right thing. But, we still need to keep, the issue that you asked about was the issue of the boycott. I have a slightly different take on the boycotts than what some others have had, what Stacey Abrams and some others have had. We have not called for a boycott.
Well, hold on a second, Cliff. I want to get to your comments about the boycott, but I want to ask you, Melvin. So you heard Cliff, he just said, look, the corporations did something, but had they come out more, had their efforts been more robust, had they been more public, had they engaged the community more, maybe there would have been a different outcome. What do you say in response to that?
Well, he's right. Some of the things that he has stated about how they have done other things, say, outwardly. So I definitely don't disagree with what he's saying. And I wish they had been earlier in the process, made their voices heard. We may not be where we are right now. So I do agree with that. And I'm hopeful that they will make the right decision to address this head on. So there's still a window where we can get to a better place.
Well, what do you say to those that say this looks like just a consumer marketing kind of ploy, that these corporations are going to go whichever way the wind blows? So when their consumers, want them to take a stand, they'll take it. But, we heard Mitch McConnell basically tell them, get in your place, take your nose out of politics. Do you think that, this is all about money for these corporations, or they really feel like this is the right thing to do and they're going to put the full weight of their corporations behind it?
well, if I can just say, when I heard Mitch McConnell, like everybody else, I was saying, well, stop taking the check. So, but I believe that some of the corporations definitely want to be on the right side of history. Mm-hmm. And so, again, when you look at Atlanta and what Atlanta represents, the history of our city, these corporations understand. And so there's an opportunity for them still to step up and do the right thing.
All right, Cliff, jump in. Your thoughts about this boycott. Like I said, Bernice King, Stacey Abrams, very prominent African-American, social justice activists. We know where their hearts are. We know where their work has been. They're saying, boycott, probably not the right thing to do at this time. What's your position?
Yeah, and those are two sisters that I have the deepest respect for. In fact, when I see Stacey Abrams, I greet her as Madam Governor, right? But, family can disagree. And so I think, the reality is this. Two things we have to keep in mind. We do have to be strategic and targeted about how anybody considers a boycott or calls for a boycott. Our coalition has not actually called for a boycott. The clergy who is a part of our coalition did, and we support them on that. Officially, we have not called for a boycott, but we have not discouraged folks from doing a boycott. And I think that's a subtle difference, right? I understand that you got to be targeted. I understand that you got to be strategic. Sometimes you got to say, well, okay, exactly which products are we going to boycott, right? You might even say, okay, let's think about the timing of boycott. Maybe we're not just trying to do a never-ending boycott or one that's just attached to like specific goals and objectives, or maybe we're just going to do a week-long boycott just to show the economic impact we can have. Keep in mind, the Montgomery bus boycott wasn't started to be a year-long boycott. It was started to be a one-day boycott. But after the success of that day, they decided to keep it going and keep it going and keep it going. And so there's a way to do the strategy. And part of that strategy is that you've got to think about who's impacted. We don't want our vulnerable communities to be impacted. But there are two things we got to keep in mind, two other things we got to keep in mind. One, some of these industries and some of these events, we got to be clear. People talk about the economic impact of moving the All-Star game. Ain't too many black businesses around the Braves Stadium, in part because they did some white flight from Atlanta to go to Cobb County, right? Arguably to get away from black folks. And so there aren't a whole lot of marginalized black communities that are being impacted positively by, having those games be over there to begin with. Same thing with the Masters. They're talking about, we're coming because we want to help out these vulnerable communities. We have a lot of partner organizations in those vulnerable communities, those black communities of Augusta, who haven't really seen the economic benefits. So when we talk about, we don't want them to go away because we'll lose some of the benefits, part of what we got to challenge is to what extent are we benefiting from some of these things to begin with?
Yeah, we can't just use the benefit word. It's kind of a blanket word. It becomes a cliche, and you give the impression that African Americans are making a lot of money on golf because golf is in Atlanta or the Major League Baseball. But let me ask you this about the game being moved. Controversial. Melvin, you think that was the right thing to do by Major League Baseball to move that game?
It's tough for me as a business person because we're caught in the middle of this. And I heard Cliff mention, what businesses are really being impacted. So for the few that are, there's tremendous pain, and there are few, and so we have to say, what can we do to help them survive and get past this difficult situation? Understand that the pandemic alone had already put them in a weakened position. Right. So there's some things that we need to do if they're the ones who are going to take the hardest hit. So that's really where our focus is now, is what can we do for those handful of businesses that we don't want to see go under because they're going to miss what would have been more than a double in terms of their business volume. So I won't go as far as to say that it was the right thing to do, but I'll say what I've heard others say. I understand, but the pain is real.
Cliff, help us understand. You said you guys are working with the coalition of clergy, and it was the clergy that called originally for the boycott. Having worked with the clergy, help us understand what they had in mind as it relates to a boycott. Like, what would it look like? Would you stop buying Coca-Cola? Would you, not buy it at your local fast food restaurant? Would you not buy it at a restaurant? How would that boycott look?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a combination of strategies. I think, there's boycotting and encouraging individuals to make different choices. There's encouraging, certain establishments. For example, the mayor of Savannah, before Coca-Cola issued their much stronger statement after the bill was signed, the mayor of Savannah said that their city was going to reevaluate their relationship with Coca-Cola. So there can be institutional boycotts of products. And again, I don't want to just pick on Coca-Cola, right? Because Pepsi's been kind of quiet too, right? So I don't want to just pick on Coca-Cola. At least they've made a belated strong statement. But I'm just using that as an example that you can have individuals, you can have cities, you can have other institutions that use that economic power. I want to, a point that was just made, and I agree with my brother that Black businesses have been hit hard by the pandemic, but that really demonstrates the point about why the economic consequences of boycott can't necessarily be, that's not something we can look at in isolation. The reality is our communities and our businesses are already dealing with economic impacts. Voter suppression is not an economic neutral issue, right? For example, the example that was given, Black businesses have suffered because of the pandemic. Why? Because we've got a governor that has failed in many ways on this pandemic. How was that governor put in? Through voter suppression. And so voter suppression is already having an economic impact on our communities, our families, our businesses. If we are going to suffer economic impact, it's better off that we do it as we are actually fighting for and advancing a strategy that gets us our voting rights and our other human rights.
Yeah, I'm so glad you said that, because when I think about how Georgia has been impacted by COVID, everything from, no mask mandate, from opening early, from not following the CDC guidelines, that's all because you have in place a Republican governor and a Republican legislature. And how did they get there? Because of voting. So we don't go to the root of this problem and make voting available. And we have seen that you guys can turn out voters. You guys can go to work. I mean, you've just shown the nation what you can do. So I think about Dr. King too. Dr. King was all about the bigger vision. And I hear you, Melvin. I'm a business owner. And so I know the pain that business owners face, but sometimes we've got to make sacrifices for the greater good. So I'm just wondering if, some of those businesses, maybe we got to get together and have some rent parties or something to make sure those businesses don't go out of business while we do the business of making sure that people are not disenfranchised. You talked though, Melvin, or Cliff, you talked about that institutional, boycotts or things that cities can do. We've heard the Republicans say, well, they can push back too. They can raise corporate taxes. They can retaliate against businesses. So how is that playing into the calculus that Coke and Delta and some of these other companies are making? Because they may face some very, punitive laws, because we know these Republicans, they ruthless. They're going to get done what they, need to get done. So, Melvin, are businesses concerned about that? The retaliation that they could see from this legislature?
Well, they are analyzing, and it's their business, it's their job to know what the different risks are. And business is about managing risk. But I definitely believe that these corporate leaders want to be on the right side of history, and they're going to make the right decision.
But are they willing to do that if it means higher corporate taxes in the state of Georgia?
I believe so.
Okay. All right. I want to bring Shanice Turner. Let me bring in my other guest. Her name is Shanice Turner. She's an entrepreneur, advocate, and vocal artist. She's been vocal on these voting laws and has been out actively working, to address them. I wanted to ask you, Shanice, you're an actress. You work in the entertainment field. You're an artist, at least. You work in the entertainment field. We know there's a lot of production in Atlanta. Atlanta has a lot of Hollywood going on. So should we see the entertainment business doing more, the industry, I should call it, getting more involved? Because there are so many, big productions. Steve Harvey is there. Tyler Perry is in Georgia. So we're talking about some pretty major players in the entertainment field. I think you're on mute, Shanice. Can you?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Go ahead.
So I believe so, because there's a lot of
Yeah, we still don't have your audio. There's something going on, Rashad, with her audio. Can you try it again, Shanice? Okay, while she's doing that, let me ask you, Cliff, what do you think? There's so much entertainment, in Georgia. It's a hub. Should we have more voices speaking out about this from the entertainment industry?
Yeah, we should definitely. We want to see more voices from the entertainment industry, more voices even from the sports industry. The MLB did their thing, but there's still individual teams and athletes that can do more, right? Same thing with the NBA. LeBron and More Than a Vote, his organization have said some things, but there's more that could be done. So definitely the entertainment industry, especially as you said at Atlanta, the Hollywood of the South, or whatever you want to call us nowadays, there's a lot that could be done. I think I wanted to comment quickly on the other point, the other question that you asked about the impact. At the end of the day, this is what we know. A couple of years ago, companies went as far on some of these bathroom bills. They went further than they are now. They said, if you pass this, we will leave your state. And none of those companies have suffered, right? We may remember a couple of years ago when Nike did their commercials with Kaepernick, and some folks, the MAGA folks, were getting upset and said, I'll never buy another Nike. Last time I checked, Nike's doing pretty well, right? And so, at the end of the day, you can't really find a situation where these companies that have taken a stand have really suffered economically. We don't want the analysis to be that. I think Melvin made the great point. This shouldn't be an analysis that's based on cost benefit or economic analysis, right? You're either on the side of Jim Crow or you're not. You're either on the side of the voters and democracy or you're not. This is a moral question. But if they are going to do that kind of economic calculation, guess what? The economics are pretty much on their side. Even Mitch McConnell said, we want you to be quiet, but no, I'm not talking about the donations. I'm not talking about the donations, right? So
shut up and dribble, but keep giving us your money, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, and we know, we saw Trump, when Colin Kaepernick started kneeling, protesting. We saw Trump call for a boycott of the NFL, and it didn't get very far. People didn't stop watching the NFL. They didn't. Maybe the ratings had a slight dip, but overall, they didn't take a big hit financially. I want to go back to you, Melvin. You talked about this meeting, this important meeting that's coming up next week. Who's invited to the meeting, and who's hosting the meeting?
So it would be the corporate leaders in Atlanta, and we've got some big time companies that are headquartered here. So those are the usual suspects, and then it would be the faith-based leaders, to my knowledge. But that is, we'll see what the outcome is from that, and so I'm looking at next week as that window. It's still open. So.
All right. I think we have Shanice back. Do we have your audio, Shanice?
Yes.
Okay, great. I wanted you to jump in. I know you have been working on the grounds, galvanizing, organizing, folks around this law. Tell us, what you're hearing from people that you're working with.
So I'm hearing that there's frustration, like going to the Capitol to support Park, and just seeing how a lot of our millennials and just all generations coming together and seeing how can we stand together to make sure that everything is going well. And the frustration is fueling the fire for us to take action. And without action, we wouldn't be here.
Yeah, I want to ask you, Cliff, are you invited to this big meeting next week?
I don't plan on attending.
You know about it?
Yeah, I know about it. No, we're in regular communications with Bishop Jackson. Fair Fight has been involved. Other members of our coalition have been involved. We may have some organizational representation be there. I just personally don't plan on being there. But we are working to get some other folks, and actually to get some of these 72. If we have some of the local 72 Black executives, we're sending out an invite to even have some of them come and participate if Coca-Cola has not already invited them. So we are involved in those discussions, but I probably won't be there myself.
Help us understand, Melvin, what's the best outcome of this meeting? Let's say, if everything goes swimmingly well, what do you come out of the meeting with? What are the, marching orders out of this meeting?
So the community would like the corporate leadership in Atlanta to take a unified stand to say that this legislation as it exists is not good for the people of the state of Georgia.
Okay. And so just make that declaration? Is that all and I don't want to say all, because maybe that's a big deal, but is it, just to come out with a statement that this legislation is bad for democracy, is bad for Georgia?
So a united voice, okay, and then they may decide that, okay, here's the next step or next steps, but I know that the community wants them to denounce or take a strong stand to say that this legislation as it exists is not good for the state.
I know you're not going to the meeting, Cliff. I assume that means LaTosha Brown, your co-founder, won't be there as well?
That's our understanding right now, but we're still having some discussions around like what exactly our involvement will be. But what I do know is that the clergy, Bishop Jackson and their coalition have been making the same demands that the rest of the coalition has been making, right? That first and foremost, we want this bill repealed, and we want these companies to speak to that. There's never been a law passed that can't be unpassed. So that's one of the demands that they're making. They're also making the demands that these companies speak out aggressively in these other states like Texas and Florida, Arizona, and speaking out and doing in those states what they failed to do in the case of Georgia, and that they also speak out in support of voting rights, in support of H.R. 1 and H.R. 4. I do want to add that there's a great company, some people may know the company Patagonia Outdoor Wear. They've really given a template on what companies can do to go beyond the statements. They came out and did a whole press release yesterday announcing 3 actions. Full disclosure, we are one of the organizations.
They gave y'all a lot of money, Cliff.
That's right.
I do my research.
I know it. See, that was a perfect segue, right? But yeah, full disclosure, we're one of the organizations that they're going to be giving a significant grant to, but I'm not saying it just because of that.
I ain't gonna put you on blast. Y'all have to go Google if you want to find out how much it is.
No, I mean, it's fine. They're actually doing $1 million commitment, not just to us, but to us and New Georgia Project, who I got to mention because they've been huge partners, New Georgia Project and New Georgia Project Action Fund, huge partners in this coalition, as well as in the wider voter mobilization work that we do, so deserving of that. But that's not the only thing they're saying. They're also saying that they're going to play a role in advocating and pulling in other businesses into these discussions and getting others to take a stand and educating other companies on why this voter suppression is so bad. And so they're taking a much more active stand than just the statements that some companies have done. That's the big picture.
They're taking a leadership role. They're not just standing on the side saying, yeah, this is good. They're going to lead the way and show other corporations how to do it. Shanice, let me ask you, where do you and young folks like you in Georgia, where do you all stand on this boycott issue? You think it's a good idea?
So when action isn't being made, action's taken. And just like boycotts, like in Atlanta, this is throughout history. When the people's voices are not being heard, especially a lot of movements are started by young people and co-led by those who are more seasoned, it makes us want to take even more action. Now, sometimes it may not be the right appropriate action, but this is what happens when frustration builds up. It needs to go somewhere. I mean, it's better than vandalizing and causing destruction. But to know that you're taking it to your own hands and you're pushing it and you're making it through and you're thinking about like, what's going to cause the most momentum to be shifted. And boycotting has always proven throughout history, throughout times, even now, to be effective. Because when you think about boycotting, you think about we're choosing to put and invest our money into different places. If you don't support the issues that's clearly affecting the people, it may not affect you because you may be of a certain tax bracket, but it's affecting your customers, your consumers.
Right.
So what do they always say? The customer is always right.
Well, we know, Shanice, you had an opportunity to work with the great late John Lewis. So you learned from the best. I'm sure he would be proud of you and the work that you're doing, trying to get millennials to not only get involved, but to stay involved in this issue. Melvin, I want to go back to you, though, on this meeting. This meeting. Cliff said, repeal this law. And I'm a lawyer. Laws are made. Laws can be repealed. Do you think that's going to come up in this meeting? Is that going to be on the table to go further than just issuing a statement, but to issue a statement that calls for the legislature to repeal the law?
Yeah, I agree that all of that is definitely going to be discussed. And then, don't know the outcome. I'm just optimistic, but I don't know what the outcome will be. But I know that pending that outcome, things are going to go in a direction, one way or the other. That's just how things are shaping up. But to Cliff's point, those other measures, after making that strong communication and unity, and then those other measures, I can definitely see that being the positive outcome of the meeting.
Well, Cliff, let me ask you this. What's going to make your organization, you guys carry a lot of weight. You have a big voice, you have a big national platform, you have a big platform in Georgia. What's going to push you to the point where you say, yes, we stand with the clergy and a boycott should happen? Like if this meeting happens and, a statement is released, but nothing further than a statement, is that going to push your organization towards a boycott? Or what do you think, might be that catalyst?
Yeah, I think if following this meeting, if there's no plans of actions, if there are no commitments made about how they're going to step up their response, how they're going to go deeper than just the statements that they've done, at that point, I think it will kind of become clear. You asked the question about, is this just a marketing ploy, right? If they go through the motions of doing this meeting and yet they still don't come out with any other further plans of action, then at that point we got to start to be a little bit more skeptical about these statements that they've made, and then we may have to take it to the next level. So at this point, nothing's off the table. I know for the clergy and Bishop Jackson and that coalition, nothing's off the table, and so we'll see what happens. But I also want to keep in mind that this is also about other companies that were engaging. There was a protest today, a rally at AT&T in Texas, right? For the same reasons. AT&T has donated over $500,000 in Texas. They're a Texas-based company, and they've donated to these politicians in Texas that are pushing the voter suppression. And so there was a rally today at AT&T. So we're going to be looking at AT&T and what their actions are. And so there's a lot of different players involved in this, a lot of different states. It's all one movement. Each state is speaking to the needs and the issues and the legislation in the other states. And so I think at the end of the day, it's not just going to be a one-off strategy. We're going to have to take a very close look at, what does an intentional and planned boycott strategy look like, which companies, which products, which states, and all of that. And so there's going to be a lot of discussions around this moving forward. Nothing is off the table at this point.
Well, you think about Kemp, and it seems like to me that his political future is invested in this law because he's up for re-election next year. And I don't know if Stacey Abrams is going to run, but clearly he would be vulnerable if she did run. But beyond the governor's race, is there a strategy to flip some of those seats in your state legislature? Because we know that, so many of these repressive laws get passed because state legislatures are, predominantly Republican throughout the country.
Yeah, and there's been a strategy. The strategy hasn't just been over the past 10 years, hasn't just been a presidential strategy or a Senate race strategy or even a gubernatorial strategy. There's been a strategy targeting some of these state legislative seats for a long time now. this issue is actually going to expose many of them. See, they're counting on, and by them I'm talking about the Georgia legislature, they're talking about, or they're banking on that the suppression that they're passing is going to make it so that they can't be beat, right? They're picking their voters versus the voters picking them. But what it can also do is this: there have been some of these legislators that have been hiding because not a lot of people really follow. To be honest, not a lot of people really follow what goes on in the Capitol and these state legislatures, these bills,
Around the
right?
country, really, not just in Georgia. I mean,
Not
Georgia,
exactly.
voter interest in local politics is really low.
Exactly. And so this issue has exposed many of them because we're going to be able to go to some of these districts and some of these counties and say, look, did you know that your legislator voted for this Jim Crow bill? That's partially what happened in this county, Hancock County, Georgia, where one of the main leaders, Republican leaders pushing the legislature, in addition to being a state House rep, he's also was a county attorney in Hancock County, which is like 87% black. And so when the people found out that their county attorney was pushing this voter suppression, they said, heck no, he needs to lose his job. And so they went to their county commission demanding that he loses his job. And so this issue is going to expose some of these representatives. I think that this is going to have an impact when it comes to these legislative seats in a couple of years.
Well, I'm out of time. I just want to thank all of you. Melvin, I want you to send me an email about that meeting. I want to know what happens. I want to be a fly on the wall in that meeting. My friend Cliff ain't going, so I can't call him to ask him what happened in the meeting, so I got to rely on you to send me an email to let me know. Shanice and I need to know what happens. Well, Shanice, let me ask this before I let you go. Are young people like Shanice coming to this meeting? Have they been invited?
She's like, probably not.
All right, I ain't gonna put you on blast.
She's like,
I invited you to my show. I gotta treat you with respect. But obviously, young folks like Shanice are going to drive change across this country. They are the future. So next time y'all have a meeting, hook my girl up, get her to the meeting, get someone like her to the meeting, because they need to have a voice at the table too. Now, there are going to be a lot of black women at this meeting, right?
Well, Cliff knows more about the attendance than I do, okay? I just know that there is such a meeting, and if the outcome is going to take us in one direction or the other.
Okay. Shanice, let you have the last word since you ain't invited to the meeting. How can we help you? Anything you're doing that we can support you on?
Definitely. I'm going to be doing a lot of voting mobilization projects here in Atlanta. I just finished a Peaches to Polls voting empowerment brunch with Opportunity United in my LLC, Shanice Speaks. And I do want to speak about the entertainment business, especially about it, the voter suppression, and that it does in fact affect the entertainment business. That a lot of the studios, not only just acting, but voiceover work as well, are being affected by the voter suppressions. And a lot of them, if you guys don't know, have already released a press release stating that they do not support the voting suppression because it affects the clientele that's coming in, and if their voice actors or actors will accept the work to either work on said campaign or show.
Right. No, it has obviously far-reaching impact on all businesses and all industries. Again, thank you guys. All right, Melvin, you gonna call me about the meeting. Always good to see you, Cliff and Shanice. Keep on being brilliant. We love what you're doing. We love supporting young folks. You call Cliff up because they got a lot of money now, so they probably can help small organizations like yours.
That's right. We got you, Shanice. We got you.
You got me? Okay.
That's right.
All right, guys. Take care.
For an email.
Thanks to all of my guests for joining me today. I love being able to talk to folks who are on the ground who know what's happening. This Georgia voting law is not just about Georgia. It's about states all over this country. You heard my first guest, Danielle, say that over 300 such laws have been introduced into state houses around this country. So this is a serious issue. And if it hasn't touched your state yet, it's probably going to in the near future. So I want you to keep your eyes out for what happens in Georgia, because what happens in Georgia may be happening in your state next. Some words to live by before I get out. 75 years ago this July, a World War II veteran named Maceo Snipes reportedly became the first Black man to cast a ballot in his rural Georgia county. The next day, a white man shot him in his front yard, and Mr. Snipes soon died from those wounds. Fortunately, 3 generations removed from the political reign of terror that claimed Mr. Snipes' life, voter suppression seems much less likely to arrive by bullet. But we may not be as distant in our political moment from theirs as we might think. The long struggle to block access to the ballot has always relied on legal maneuvering and political schemes to achieve what bullets and bombs alone could not do. The methods in the fight against voting rights have a common objective: an electorate narrowed along predictable and demonstrable fault lines. Many present-day proponents of voting restrictions, they're so quick to distance themselves from the racist aims and attitudes of their forebears, but the most durable and enduring attacks on voting rights have long cloaked their goals in race-neutral language, at least in writing. Now, it's not the language that scares me, but it's their actions. So we need to be vigilant and watch not just what they say, but what they do. I'm out, y'all. Be safe out there. Don't forget to wear your mask, and don't forget we're all in this together.